Welcome to the Pharmacist Voice Podcast, episode 266. I'm your host, Kim Newlove. My guest today is Dr. Tony Dow, host of Pharmacy IT and Me podcast and the Orange County Pharmacists Association podcast, also known as the CPHIMS podcast. This is the 5th episode in my Pharmacist Podcasters Series. If you're new to this series, welcome. My guests are all pharmacist podcasters, as you could probably guess, and they all talk about their podcasts. It's also a behind-the-scenes look at each podcast, so that if you're interested in starting a podcast too, my guest and I can give you some insights about podcasting and inspire you to use your voice too. By the way, if you're interested in starting a podcast, I can help. I help pharmacists start podcasts. There are 2 ways to work with me. The first way is my self-paced online course. It focuses on planning your podcast. And the second way is with one-on-one coaching. You can find a link to that self-paced online course by clicking the store tab on my website, which is thepharmacistvoice.com. For private coaching, click on the contact tab on my website and leave a message. The website again is thepharmacistvoice.com. I hope to hear from you soon. The course and the coaching both help you cut the learning curve so you can be a pharmacist podcaster someday too. Next, I'll tell you a little more about my guest, Dr. Tony Dow, then we'll dive right into the interview. Dr. Tony Dow is a seasoned informatics pharmacist with over a decade of experience in both pharmacy informatics and inpatient clinical pharmacy. Throughout his career, Tony has been leveraging technology to enhance patient care and streamline pharmacy operations. Tony is deeply committed to education and is actively involved in teaching pharmacy informatics at various pharmacy schools. His passion for sharing knowledge extends beyond the classroom as he frequently contributes to pharmacy organizations, advocates for advancements in the field, and shares pharmacist stories through his podcasting. In addition to his pharmacy endeavors, Tony is also a co-owner and operator of an escape room, where he applies his creativity and problem-solving skills to craft immersive and challenging experiences for players. That sounds like a lot of fun. That ends my introduction for Dr. Tony Dow. At this time, let's dive into my conversation about podcasting with Dr. Tony Dow. Why did you start Pharmacy IT and Me podcast?
Actually, I will probably talk about Pharmacy IT and Me and also the local organization podcast I also started, CPHA, which I'll explain a little bit later what that means. But yeah, like for me, my former job required me to commute 100 miles one way. I did that a lot. And my friends have always asked me, how do I keep busy? I'm like, I don't know. And then someone suggested, what about podcasts? So I started listening to podcasts, and I got to the point where I think I was listening to like weekly podcast series of like maybe 20 to 30 series. But because I was driving so much, I would be able to listen to the entire like 20 to 30 like weekly podcasts that I listened to. And I also got used to the idea of like listening at 2.5 speed because my brain started like functioning that way. So, you know, podcasts are a big thing for me. And I guess like for Pharmacy IT and Me, the initial feeling of like wanting to contribute back to that field. And I felt there was a lack of pharmacy informatics resources that was easily accessible. It's not that there's a lack of resources in general. It's just accessible or easy to find. Initially, I thought about doing a YouTube channel. There was a couple of things that held me back. One of them is I don't like being on camera. But, you know, YouTube is YouTube and you have to be on camera. And I really considered that because, you know, that's one of the best ways that people can find information. I mean, I find information that way. So I was looking around to see like if anyone had pharmacy informatics resources on YouTube, and I saw that Brian Fung actually already had a channel. And, you know, for me, I'm like, oh no, like I have imposter syndrome, right? So I'm like, I'm not going to start a YouTube channel. This guy knows everything. It sounds like he knows everything, so I'm not going to do that. So I stayed off of that, and, you know, with the whole idea of like not liking to be on camera, it was just another justification for me to like not do that. When I looked into podcasts, at the time, this was around 2017, I didn't find a pharmacy informatics dedicated podcast yet. So that's where I was like, maybe I should do one. It kind of planted some seeds of like possibly starting one. So that's how that started. But 2017 was when I started thinking about that. It wasn't until like January 2019 that I actually launched the Pharmacy IT podcast. So lots of stuff, other thoughts happened in between. So I had this aversion to risk. I didn't want to start a professional podcast until I knew how to make it good to my standards. Because I was like, I've listened to a lot of podcasts, and I don't like the ones that, the audio quality is like not like on par, or it sounds like, someone's speaking on the old school telephones. Like it just makes me feel like it's hard to listen to. So I wanted to make sure that, just not from quality standpoint, but also from editing, that everything's good, like good to the standard of like what I've been listening to myself. So locally, I thought it'd be also nice to start a podcast for the Orange County Pharmacists Association. And that's an organization I was involved in for a number of years as digital outreach chair, still am. And I was also one of the past presidents. And we had such a nice variety of different professionals. So from like law to industry to informatics to community to academia, just everything, right? So I thought it'd be a great opportunity to highlight the different pathways, since a lot of the times our networking events had a lot of students or pharmacists in the field just coming up and asking us about our roles. And I'm like, well, let's just do this podcast for the organization. It's easy for people to kind of like just search and listen to the roles that they're interested in. So at the time, I thought Pharmacy ITME was like, it'd be something that I would practice at first with the CPHIMS local podcast before I, went to Pharmacy ITME, since the local one's a smaller audience, and Pharmacy ITME was like, I was going to leave that for whoever wants to listen, right? So that's that. However, because OCPHA is a professional podcast like sound that I wanted to go for, that was still not enough for me to start on the path of podcasting, because I was like, I know nothing about podcasting, right? So basically, my very first podcast I started, which I still run today, is a super low-key podcast about nerd media and video games and movies, which I don't really tell like people in my professional world what they are, what the podcast is. But it was a podcast that I did to keep in touch with my friend at the time in Sweden and my other friend at the time in Kansas City. And we basically kept in touch, and it was a way to practice a podcast recording and editing. And I actually made a lot of good friends in the industry too, from that side of things with the podcast. And, doing that in 2017, practicing for a couple years, just like also catching up and goofing off like on the podcast with my friends. It was like, basically how I got my comfort level to a certain point. Then in October 2018 was when I launched the OCPHA podcast. And then a few more months in January 2019 was when I launched the Pharmacy IT and Me podcast. So that was like a super long-winded origin story, I guess, of the podcast journey for me.
It's exactly what I wanted. And thank you for telling all of the stories. I didn't know about the Nerd Media podcast. Is that what it was called? The Nerd Media podcast?
Oh no, we have a name for it. I just don't like sharing it on my professional circles.
That's fine.
Yeah. But
That's
it was
fine.
it's about nerd media. It's about the video game industry. One of my friends works in the video game industry, so it's nice to talk about those kind of things. So it's a very different kind of like, a type of topics we talk about. We talked about the video game industry in the past year, its successful stuff and failures, and how AI has affected the movie industry, those kind of things. Those were the things that we talked about.
I think that's great that you wanted to do the thing back in 2017 and you dove in with friends. So you felt supported and welcomed, and you didn't worry so much about judging yourself. You were just having a good time, but also using that good time to develop your recording, editing, and production skills. I know what it's like to be there. It is not easy at first, and I put out a lot of content that was not my best work at first. So I kind of like what you did, because you held yourself to a high standard when you did it as a pharmacist who was putting your professional reputation out there. It really resonated with me that you said that you wanted to have a good listener experience. So you wanted to really learn how to do it well, so that some of those podcasts that you listened to that were unacceptable audio quality, you didn't join that category, basically. And I respect that. Audience experience, the listener experience, is so important to me. That's why I edit a lot of my podcasts very extensively, so that there's a clear beginning and ending, and in between, the audio quality is good and there's not volume changes. So we have that in common. Love the origin story, though. I love that you wanted to do something for the pharmacy IT space, and Pharmacy IT and Me was it. That's great. And then the OCPHA podcast, which I have actually been a guest on, I looked it up. It was episode 60. Thanks again for having me on that podcast. You do a great job with that.
Well, thank you. I mean, that means a lot coming from you, knowing that, you do the voiceover work and a lot of the podcasting yourself. Because I'm doing this as a hobby, so it's pretty cool to hear. And thank you so much for saying that.
You're welcome. You're making a good impact. And when I was listening to the OCPHA podcast to find out, what is this about? I got your invitation, but of course I wanted to check it out. And one of the episodes that I listened to was Corinne Wong, Pharm.D. She ended up being a guest on my podcast. I don't know if you know this, but it was because of you and your podcast. Did you know that?
Oh, yeah. I think I talked to Corinne and she had mentioned that. That she met you with through the podcast, pretty much.
Yep, she made a great guest. She is a lot of fun to talk to. She's just totally girl, loves to talk about everything. She's awesome to talk to.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. She definitely had her facts in a row, though, when you interviewed her. It was very easy to follow her story and what she did. And yeah, that was great. Now, as far as a YouTube podcast, I am kind of curious now. Do you have the Pharmacy IT and Me podcast and the OCPHA podcast syndicated to YouTube so that people can watch it just as an audio only file there on YouTube?
That's interesting you mentioned that. I don't remember if I completed the process for the OCPHA one. It's been a while since I looked at that side. But the Pharmacy IT and Me podcast, a couple months ago, I started the process of syndicating it onto YouTube. My issue was I didn't have access to the tools before to do that quickly and easily. But now there are more tools available to pull from an RSS feed of the podcast and then create a YouTube video of just audio and then bring it over to YouTube. So now it is available. So if you do search for the podcast Pharmacy IT and Me on YouTube, you'll most likely find it too.
Awesome. I know that YouTube has been said to be the second biggest search engine in the world at this time. And I just thought your original instincts were good, get on YouTube. But even if it's not your face, your audio can live on YouTube, which is pretty cool. And it sounds like you're there. Good job.
So I avoided that initially because lack of the tools, and also the when I looked into the YouTube algorithms and how they kind of promote videos and demote videos, it was all about retention on the video itself. So I was concerned about the podcasts are not short files like videos, right? I was just more worried about retention rate, and then that just demoting the entire YouTube page. But eventually, when things got easier to push over there, and I also thought about it, it's just another avenue. If people are going to look for it, they will look for it. So then I didn't worry as much about the retention and the algorithm as much as I was this is just another avenue and space for them to find the media in. So that's why I ended up pushing it over to YouTube as well.
I consider YouTube to be just another podcast player when it comes to my audio-only content. Yeah, it's something that anybody interested in starting a podcast might need to know about, though, because they may think that, oh, I'm on the podcast players, and therefore I can't be on YouTube. But no, you can have both. And the more we talk about these things, the more people know about them. That's why I bring it up.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the next thing. I don't think I put this on the list, but I'm going to start asking all of my pharmacist podcasters, what do you talk about on your podcasts?
On the Pharmacy IT and Me podcast, I usually have 3 types of episodes. Initially, when I started the podcast, I did release 3 episodes a week. That was not sustainable. So, but I have 3 types of episodes. One episode is basically called Last Week in Health IT, and it's just summarizing some of the different healthcare IT news I found interesting, and just talking a little bit about it. So I do that. Like I used to do that every week. Life gets in the way, so now I actually don't do a lot of those kind of things anymore. But that's one type of episode I had, in which the audience is more so, anyone who's interested in that type of information, keeping up to date with health IT. The second type of episode was more like educational, where I take a concept from pharmacy informatics or my day job, just something like that, and then kind of expand a little bit about it, like maybe a 5 to 10 minute episode, kind of bite size, and then I talk about that. And usually target audience for that too is like people who are either brand new and don't know anything about these concepts, or on the episodes where I talk about things that I'm applying at work. Those are more targeted to people who are already in the field and might find use in the tool that I'm using or in my experience. And then the third type is, all the interview episodes. Those are the ones where I interview people from different career paths. And that's like anyone who's interested in getting into pharmacy informatics. That would be that type of audience. And I also make sure each of the episode types and each episode descriptions, I put like in the first liner, like what the target audience is. So when someone's going through, they could kind of see like, oh, I'm that person. I'll listen to this, kind of just like keep it easy for someone to kind of navigate and find what they want to find. OCPHA, more about like interviews of different pathways. So same kind of idea about like the interview episodes. So yeah, that's the kind of episodes I have.
You did a great job, considering I didn't even tell you I was going to talk about that. But you did also kind of get into my next question, which is, who's your audience in general for each podcast?
Yeah. And like I said, again, it kind of varies between the different episodes. But generally speaking, people within the pharmacy field that are interested in certain aspects, like for pharmacy IT, me, obviously, interested in healthcare IT or pharmacy informatics. And then for OCPHA, just anyone who's in the pharmacy field that is looking for a career change or learning more about different careers. So those are the primarily the main two audiences.
Very good. Do you interact with your audience by any chance? I mean, do you have a LinkedIn page for Pharmacy IT and Me or the OCPHA podcast?
Not in the traditional sense. I mean, we do like for OCPHA, we do send out like mailing lists to our subscribers, asking if anyone wants to be featured on the podcast. We don't have much people like commenting on our pages, like on LinkedIn. We do post it. It's just not commented on a lot on the official page. Same thing with Pharmacy IT and Me. Like I do share them on our official page. Most of the time, the interaction comes from direct messages and people reaching out to me directly and asking questions. That's where I kind of see the most interaction with my audience. Or sometimes at conferences, some of them will recognize my name but not my face, and then say, "Aren't you the guy that runs the podcast?" Which is still weird to me because I have this whole like imposter syndrome thing. But that's how I interact with my audience. Not a lot of interaction on social media.
I was just curious because the only way that I know who my audience is for this podcast is for people to contact me via email or on my LinkedIn page for the podcast or social media for the podcast. Otherwise, I don't know, who my audience is. The ones that do contact me are the pharmacists, pharmacy students, pharmacy technicians, etc. It's always interesting to hear from the audience. I'm just kind of curious about what's in it for the audience to listen to the podcast. What do they get out of it? Or what do they tell you on social media or direct message that they're getting out of your podcasts?
Generally speaking, the audience for both podcasts really benefit from like hearing the different types of career paths out there. Because, the general public knowledge of like what a pharmacist does is still very limited. And even as a pharmacy student, right? Like coming into pharmacy school, my first year, I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to go to hospital or retail. But nope, like later on, I learned about pharmacy informatics. So I think like, generally speaking, the audience would benefit a lot from hearing about what's really out there. I try to put myself in the shoes of someone who's curious about these pathways. And to be honest, it's because I really don't know a lot about all the different pathways out there myself. So I try to be like the audience's proxy and ask the questions that they may be curious about so that it's trying to be as useful as I can to whoever's listening to.
I love that answer because when you think about what's in it for the audience, you're really serving them well. When you think about what questions might they have and how can I answer that on my podcast, that is exactly what I feel podcasters should be doing on a podcast. Way to go, Tony. Love it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Once your audience hears your message, they learn about pharmacy IT or a different career path through the OCPHA podcast, what do you want them to do with that information?
I think I want them to take action on it because the main thing is you need to take action in your own career. You can't just let things be handed to you. It doesn't work that way most of the time. So I really hope that, when they listen to what's out there, if they hear something interesting, they take the steps to reach out. They take the steps to find a mentor or even reach out to the guest directly for those who actually provide like contact information on the podcast to kind of just like take that next step and finding out if that's something they really want to do or getting more information so they can make an informed decision about their career path later.
I love that. That's great. I think that sometimes when we start a podcast and we put stuff out there, there's this opportunity to have a call to action, especially at the end of a podcast. For example, you'll talk about some pharmacy IT topic, and then maybe at the end you'll review it, and then you'll say, now I want you to take this information, and if you're in practice, I want you to go do that. Or if you find a tool that has to do with what I'm talking about today, I want you to share that with me. It's pretty cool that as podcasters, we have that really intimate connection with the person who we're talking to. I appreciate that you have a call to action. You want them to take action. That's good. Use the tool or do the thing.
Yeah, and I also know it's easier said than done because in general, pharmacists are risk averse, right? Like that's just the type of personality we have. And that's, you heard in my origin story, how long it took me to launch the Pharmacy IT Me podcast, from 2017 to 2019, because I was so risk averse. And I understand that, but that first step, if you can think about that first step of just reaching out as the lowest risk action you can take is, what's the worst case? They just don't respond. But the best case, they respond, they may, take you under their wing and all that. And then you might get into like a path that you love. Like it's very difficult to see what's going to happen, but you definitely know for sure it's not going to happen if you don't take that first step.
What's that saying? Isn't it you miss 100% of the shots you don't take? Isn't that the Wayne Gretzky thing? Yeah. So, if you're interested, check it out. That's a good call to action. If you like what I'm talking about today, take action. On the flip side, yes, we talked about what's in it for your audience, but Tony, what's in it for you to have a podcast or two podcasts, really?
Like I said before, I don't really know a lot about all the different career paths out there. So I really enjoy hearing people's journeys and stories. And, for those with interesting career paths, I would hope that, they get some great ability to share their story. And whatever small part I can do, it really makes me happy because I know that, it's really hard to market yourself. Like I said, imposter syndrome, risk averse, all of that stuff. I was a very shy behind the scenes person most of my life. So I get that. And, on top of that, me interviewing others gives me like a better perspective and insight into the idea of putting yourself in other people's shoes. For example, in my day job, we work with a lot of vendors and there's a lot of frustrations that maybe had on our side of things. But, on my podcast, I do speak with some people who work on the vendor side and hearing the frustrations from their side due to the lack of information they are provided puts things in a clearer perspective for me, which, I would like to think it helps me with my day job. So, I think that's my answer for like what's in it for me.
I hear some talk about relationships. You get to have those relationships where you find out what's a day in the life of somebody else like, or what are the problems that you see from your side of the table. I appreciate that. Mm-hmm. That's a good answer. From where I sit, though, on my end of the table, I see you now as a thought leader in the pharmacy IT space. When I think of pharmacy IT, I think of you and Beju and Brian. And one of the other things that I think has happened for you, don't you and they have this online course? Would you like to talk about that too?
It's just, again, like another avenue of like information. I think like the biggest thing about pharmacy students for us is they always ask us, they ask us how to get into the field, but sometimes they don't even know what the field is. So what is pharmacy informatics? And we did get together along with David Vu, and we started the Pharmacy Informatics Academy, where we do put like a completely like free course out there, like an introductory to pharmacy informatics. It's about like 3 hours long or so. And it really just goes into the basics of like what the medication use process is, what kind of technology is being involved, what kind of things are done in clinical decision support. Just like the very basic introductory terms you would need to know when you're talking about pharmacy informatics. It's just another type of like media and resource out there. Like instead of a podcast, instead of a YouTube channel, it's now an interactive course that they can go through and click questions for answers, stuff like that. So it's just another way, and hopefully it helps students that may not have that exposure in school to kind of learn more about pharmacy informatics and making sure it's something that they really want to do versus like, oh, this is not for me, but at least I learned about it.
Sometimes it's about having the right messenger. Sometimes you need somebody who's actually in practice, not just from talking from the ivory tower, as they call it. When you get somebody who's an educator, they're talking about the theory of it. So much so that it's all in writing. They're lecturing at a university, but then they talk to you guys and you all work in that space. It's just different. It's a different messenger. So I appreciate what you're doing, having that basics course, establishing terminology, talking about the basics. I think it's great. What's the name of the course and where can my audience find it?
It's just Introductory to Pharmacy Informatics. It can be found at pharmacyinformaticsacademy.com.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Tony, we already talked about YouTube, and the Pharmacy IT and Me gets kind of pushed out there as an audio file. But where else can people find Pharmacy IT and Me and the OCPHA podcast? Those directories are full. I know, like Apple Podcasts, whatever. So do you have websites for both of those?
When I started these podcasts too, I made sure that I did the SEO correctly, so it's like easier to find. So on the podcast directories first, it's actually pretty easy to find now. So if you search for the word pharmacy informatics on the Apple podcast or most podcast directories, actually, the Pharmacy IT Main podcast will show up just from searching pharmacy informatics. And the same thing happens with OCPHA. If you just type in OCPHA, it would be the first podcast that shows up. In terms of websites, I do have pharmacyitme.com. And for OCPHA, the official organization website is ocpha.org. And the episodes can also be found on there through like the postings. Worst case, you can also find links to both on my personal website, TonyDowPharmD.com.
Thank you very much. I'll put all those links in the show notes on thepharmacistvoice.com. Next up, I know that you have already kind of dispensed a little bit of information that new podcasters can use, such as SEO, setting up the SEO right and the search terms and whether to put it on YouTube or not. But what other advice do you have for any pharmacist who might want to become a podcaster?
Yeah, I think it's a little similar to some of the social media marketing stuff. So it's more like, do not worry about your numbers. Do not worry about your subscribers. What you should be worrying about is doing something out of passion. So if you are passionate enough and you work hard enough, those numbers can come later. Like personally, I'm still dumbfounded about like how many people listen to my podcast, but I've been told it's like because the content and the interviews and what's interesting brings them back. So I would say like focus on your passion and focus on providing value. And, just another thing is just make sure it's still fun for you and not like a chore, because people will notice that, when they listen to the podcast. So I think those are some of the things I wanted to focus on.
It's all great advice, and thank you so much for sharing it. As we start to wrap this up, do you have anything coming up here in 2024 that you'd like to promote? Maybe a big episode, a milestone, anything? The floor is yours.
I don't have anything specific, but I'd like to say for the OCPHA podcast, I've been very grateful to have like a co-chair and also now a co-host. And we take turns on different episodes. But 2024, we do have a lot of episodes lined up on the OCPHA podcast for a lot of different career paths, like industry, academia. We had actually several folks from industry, and also like inpatient, ED, pediatric, which is very like interesting. So that's going to be happening on the OCPHA podcast. I also have a lot of lined up episodes from the Pharmacy IT and Me podcast, a lot on the vendor space and the health tech side. So those are things to look forward to. But yeah, nothing like super specific. Those are kind of like just the more general things that we're doing.
Very exciting. I want to guess that Jimmy Pruitt is going to be the emergency department pharmacist you're bringing in. Is that right?
Actually, no, it's more locally. So I actually spoke with my coworker in the ED for pediatric, but she has a really interesting journey because she came from critical care and started ED in her previous job because they didn't have the ED like pharmacist like role there, and she was like the one that spearheaded that in her previous role before coming to like be my coworker here. So it's really interesting to kind of hear where she got her training and how that came to fruition.
Very interesting. Yeah, you have great guests, and I look forward to seeing your content come up on my feed on LinkedIn. That's usually how I find out a new episode is out there. I wish you all the best here in 2024, and thank you so much for being here on the Pharmacist Voice podcast to share how you use your voice as a pharmacist podcaster, Tony. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks again to Dr. Tony Dow for being my guest today. We got to hear about his podcasts and also some behind the scenes stuff too. For example, I really enjoyed hearing that Tony identifies his audience in the description for each podcast episode. That is something that I can use. Podcasters learn from one another, and we serve our audience as well when we're giving them what they're looking for without making them look too hard to find it. Tony has been podcasting longer than I have, and I really appreciated him talking about what it was like in the beginning. He had some imposter syndrome, and that's normal. And he also wanted to feel confident with his audio engineering skills. He wanted to feel comfortable with podcasting before he started publishing content in the pharmacy world. I respect that. Feeling some imposter syndrome and also just wanting to be ready are natural feelings. And I hope you'll agree with that. And I must say that Tony coped beautifully. He got over the imposter syndrome, and now, to date, he has published more than 300 episodes of Pharmacy IT and Me podcast and 65 episodes of the CPHIMS podcast. Congratulations on all your success, Tony, and I must say the listener experience is excellent. Kudos to you and your engineering skills. You're doing it right. In my online course about podcasting, one of the suggestions that I make is to make practice episodes before you publish. If you don't want to publish before you feel comfortable, practice episodes are a way to go. But Tony went a different route, and I enjoyed hearing about that. Essentially, he created a practice podcast with his friends, talking about, I think he called it nerd media. That sounds like a great way to get experience too. I really appreciated him sharing that. And again, I must say that podcasters learn from other podcasters. That is some information that I can pass on to my students. As we wrap up this episode, I hope you feel inspired to use your voice after hearing how Dr. Tony Dow uses his as a pharmacist podcaster. I enjoyed our conversation, especially getting to know Tony better. As pharmacist podcasters, our paths don't always meet. I am very lucky that Tony has had me on one of his shows, and I have now had him on mine. And I am very proud to say that I am part of a small group of pharmacists who have podcasts. Tony and I, and so many more, we all are pharmacist podcasters. I enjoy the connection with them, learning from them, and just being counted among them. This has been episode 266 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Remember to check out the show notes on thepharmacistvoice.com. In the show notes, I'll have links to Dr. Tony Dow on LinkedIn, his personal website, which he mentioned during the episode, Pharmacy IT and Me podcast, the CPHA podcast, my social media links, other episodes of the Pharmacist Podcasters Series, and more. Lots of links today. Everything you need is on thepharmacistvoice.com. One last thing, if you or anyone you know is interested in pharmacy informatics or wants to know more about pharmacist career paths, please share this episode with them. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe to or follow the Pharmacist Voice podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. I'll be back next Friday, March 1st, with a new drug name pronunciation episode. Thanks for listening today. I'll talk to you next Friday.